I opened the door, and my whole body went still. She stood there, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, the other clutching her purse so tight her knuckles had gone pale. The soft amber light of the cafe spilled over her face, and for one long suspended second neither of us spoke. Then she whispered it. "Wait. I know you." Not the way you say it to a pleasant surprise. Not with warmth or a smile creeping in at the corners. She said it the way you say something when the floor just dropped out from under you. And honestly, my stomach felt exactly the same, because I knew her too. I knew the sharp precision of her voice in a boardroom. I knew the way she could dismantle an argument with 3 sentences. I knew her name on a presentation slide that I was convinced, for 3 full years, had stolen something from me. The mutual friend who set this up had no idea. How could she? I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I just stood there, holding the door open like a fool, while the woman I considered my greatest professional rival looked at me like she was deciding whether to run. And I wasn't sure I'd stop her if she did. I stepped aside anyway, not out of politeness, more out of the sheer disbelief that had rooted my feet to the floor. She hesitated for just a moment, her eyes doing that quick, calculating sweep I remembered so well. Then she walked in. We sat down across from each other at the small corner table the restaurant had reserved. Candles between us. Soft jazz somewhere in the background. The kind of setting designed to make people fall a little bit in love. It felt like a cruel joke. The waiter appeared, cheerful and oblivious, listing the evening's specials with genuine enthusiasm. I nodded at something. She ordered sparkling water, and then he was gone, and it was just the two of us. And the silence that sat between us was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that had 3 years of history packed inside it. Her name was Nadia Voss. I had not spoken that name out loud since the day I cleaned out my desk and walked out of Mercer & Lane Consulting for the last time. But I had thought it, in the quiet, honest moments I'd rather not admit to. I had thought it more than I cared to acknowledge. We had joined Mercer & Lane the same quarter. Different departments initially, but the firm had a way of colliding people, collaborative projects, shared presentations, cross-team reviews. We met in a Tuesday morning strategy meeting, and I remember thinking she was the sharpest person in that room. I also remember thinking she knew it, not in an arrogant way, in that quiet, grounded confidence that somehow makes you more aware of your own insecurities. She spoke with precision, she listened with focus, and when she disagreed with something, she did it with such calm certainty that it left you questioning yourself long after the meeting ended. For about 4 months, we were something close to colleagues who respected each other from a careful distance. And then the Aldrin account happened. The Aldrin account was the kind of project that defined careers at Mercer & Lane, a major restructuring proposal for one of the firm's oldest clients. Whoever led it successfully was essentially being handed a senior partnership track on a silver platter. We were both assigned to the preliminary research team. 6 people, long hours, a shared drive full of documents that grew messier by the week. I had poured myself into that project in a way I hadn't poured myself into anything in years. Late nights, early mornings, pages of analysis that I was genuinely proud of. Then came the final presentation review. I walked into that conference room and saw the slide deck on the screen, and my stomach dropped. The core framework, the structural breakdown I had spent 2 weeks refining, the specific language I had crafted carefully, deliberately. It was there. Under her name, I sat through that entire presentation in a kind of cold, quiet rage. Afterward, I confronted her in the hallway, and that conversation was not calm. It was not gracious. I said things that were pointed and professional enough to avoid HR, but sharp enough that she understood exactly what I was accusing her of. She looked at me, and this is the part that stayed with me. She looked at me not with guilt, but with something that almost resembled disbelief. Then she said very quietly, "You don't know what actually happened." And I said, "I know enough. I didn't get the partnership. Neither did she. As it turned out, though I didn't learn that until much later. Someone else absorbed the account entirely. The whole thing dissolved into corporate reshuffling. But the damage between us was already done. We moved through the office like 2 planets in parallel orbits, never colliding again, never acknowledging the gravity that had once pulled us close. 6 months later, I resigned. And I told myself I was relieved to never have to think about Nadia Voss again. Now she was sitting across from me in a candlelit cafe, unfolding her napkin with steady hands, while mine sat flat on the table because I didn't trust them to be still. She spoke first, which, if I'm being honest, surprised me. I had half expected us to perform the whole evening, politely endure the appetizers, make careful small talk about neutral subjects, and then part ways with the kind of handshake that meant never again. I had already mentally drafted the apologetic text I would send our mutual friend in the morning. But Nadia set down her water glass, looked at me directly, and said, "I didn't take your framework. No preamble, no softening. Just that, clean and quiet." Like she had been holding it in a closed fist for 3 years and finally decided to open her hand. I looked at her for a moment. That's an interesting way to start a first date. Something flickered at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. "Would you have preferred the weather?" "Honestly, slightly." She didn't laugh, but the tension in her shoulders shifted, just barely. She folded her hands on the table and continued, and I recognized the posture immediately. It was the same posture she used to take before she made a point she was absolutely certain of. "The slide deck you saw, the framework you recognized. Marcus forwarded it to me the night before the presentation. He told me it was the team's consolidated draft, that it had been compiled from everyone's contributions and cleared for use. Marcus, our team lead, the man who had smiled warmly at both of us throughout the entire Aldrin project and had left the firm quietly, 3 months after the presentation, for reasons nobody fully explained. I kept my expression still, but something cold moved through my chest. "He told you it was a consolidated draft," I repeated. "He told me it was a consolidated draft," she said evenly. I had no reason to question it. I trusted the process. I trusted him. She paused. I know how that sounds now. The jazz continued softly somewhere behind me. The candle between us flickered once, then steadied. I sat with what she had said, really sat with it, instead of immediately building a case against it the way I might have 3 years ago. Because the version of me who had walked out of Mercer and Lane had been so certain. Certainty had been the only clean thing left to hold on to when everything else felt like it had been taken. But there was a detail she had just named that I had never shared publicly. Not in the confrontation. Not in any conversation afterward. I had told no one specifically about Marcus forwarding documents to the team because I hadn't known that part. I had only known what I saw on the screen. "He forwarded it the night before," I said slowly. "You would have had maybe 8 hours," she said, "and I spent 6 of them refining the delivery, not the content. Because I believed the content had already been collectively built." She held my gaze steadily. "I was used, Daniel. The same as you were, just from a different angle." The way she said my name, not coldly, not warmly, but with a kind of deliberate sincerity, did something unexpected to the air between us. I looked down at the table for a moment. 3 years. 3 years of a carefully maintained certainty that had shaped decisions, colored memories, and quietly justified a bitterness I had worn, like a coat I forgot I was still carrying. "Why didn't you say this in the hallway?" I asked. "When I confronted you, you just said I didn't know what happened. You didn't explain." She was quiet for a beat, then, "Because you had already decided, and I was too proud to defend myself to someone who had already made up his mind about me." I didn't have an immediate answer for that, because she wasn't wrong. The waiter returned. We ordered, almost mechanically, and when he left again, the silence between us was different from before. It wasn't the silence of a battlefield anymore. It was the silence of 2 people standing in the ruins of a story they had each told themselves for years, finally looking at the rubble together and realizing the architecture had been wrong from the very beginning. The food arrived, and somewhere between the first course and the second, something shifted. I'm not sure I can pinpoint the exact moment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden declaration, no sweeping gesture. It was more like the way a room feels when someone finally opens a window. You don't notice the staleness until the fresh air moves through, and then you wonder how you breathed in there for so long. She picked up her fork and looked at the dish in front of her with mild suspicion. "What is this?" she said, tilting her head slightly. "Seared duck, I think. It looks like it's been through an existential crisis." I looked at my own plate. Mine, too. I think they're a matching set. She laughed, a real one, small and surprised, like it escaped before she could decide whether to allow it. And something about that sound, unexpected and unguarded in the quiet of that corner table, did something I wasn't prepared for. It made me want to hear it again. We talked differently after that. Not carefully. Not with that measured, professional distance we had both been maintaining like a contractual obligation. The conversation started to breathe on its own, moving through topics the way good conversations do, where you begin somewhere practical and end up somewhere surprisingly personal without quite knowing how you got there. She told me she had moved out of consulting entirely after leaving Mercer & Lane. She was working in organizational design now, helping companies build better internal communication structures. The irony of that was not lost on either of us, and when I pointed it out, she gave me a look that was somehow both withering and warm. "Yes, Daniel, I'm aware," she said dryly. "Just making sure you'd noticed." "Deeply noted. Thank you for that contribution. I'm a giver." She shook her head slowly, but the corner of her mouth betrayed her completely. I told her about the consultancy I had started after leaving. Small, deliberate. Nothing like the scale of Mercer & Lane, but mine in a way that nothing there had ever quite felt. She asked questions that were genuinely perceptive, and I found myself answering with more honesty than I typically offered in these kinds of conversations. There was something disarming about talking to someone who already knew the professional version of you, the sharpened, performative version, and was now sitting close enough to see the quieter one beneath it. At one point, she rested her chin in her hand, studying me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. "What?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "You're just different than I remembered. Better or worse?" She considered this with theatrical seriousness. "The jury is still deliberating," reassuring. I thought so. The cafe had grown quieter around us. A few tables had emptied. The jazz had softened to something slower, more contemplative. The kind of music that exists specifically to make people lean slightly closer without realizing they're doing it. I noticed the space between us across the table had somehow felt smaller than when we'd sat down, though neither of us had physically moved. She was telling me about a particularly chaotic client project, something involving a CEO who had communicated exclusively through handwritten memos, and she was animated in a way that I hadn't seen before. Hands moving slightly, eyes lit with exasperation and humor in equal measure. And I realized, sitting there in that candlelit corner with the rest of the room soft and distant around us, that I was watching her the way you watch someone when you're trying to quietly memorize something you're afraid might be temporary. I caught myself. She caught me catching myself. A beat of silence passed between us. Not awkward, but weighted. The kind that carries something unspoken and knows it. Then she looked down at her glass and said, very quietly, almost to herself, "I almost didn't come tonight, when I saw your name." And before I could respond, before I could find the right words to answer something that felt that honest, the waiter appeared with dessert menus, cheerful and completely oblivious. And the moment folded closed like a page. If this story is already pulling at something in you, stay with it. It's about to go somewhere neither of them expected. I ordered coffee I didn't particularly need. She ordered tea she held with both hands, like warmth was something she was trying to hold on to, and the dessert menus sat untouched between us, because neither of us was really thinking about dessert anymore. I had to ask. "Why?" I said. "When you saw my name, why did you almost not come?" She looked into her cup for a moment. The kind of pause that isn't about finding the right words. It's about deciding how honest to be. I recognized it because I had been doing the same thing all evening. Then she set the cup down carefully. "Because I knew what I had to tell you," she said. And I wasn't sure I was ready to. She had found out 3 months after the presentation. A colleague, someone who had been peripheral to the Aldrin project, quiet and largely overlooked, had reached out to her privately. This colleague had seen the original email chain, the one where Marcus had deliberately isolated my framework from the shared team folder, repackaged it, and forwarded it to Nadia under the pretense of a consolidated draft. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't a miscommunication born of a chaotic shared drive. It was calculated. Marcus had wanted the credit distributed in a way that created conflict. because conflict drew attention away from his own significant gaps in the project. If Nadia presented the framework and I erupted in accusation, the resulting drama buried the fact that Marcus had contributed almost nothing of substance to the Aldrin account himself. He had used both of us, efficiently and without apparent guilt. Nadia had sat with this information for weeks. She had drafted an email to me 3 separate times. Each time she had stopped before sending it. Why? I asked again. The word felt inadequate, but it was the only one I had. She looked at me then directly, without the careful guard she had maintained most of the evening. Because by the time I knew the truth, you had already left, she said. And I told myself it was too late. That reaching out would seem like I was absolving myself. That you'd think I was only doing it to clear my own name. She paused. And maybe part of me was afraid that even with the full truth, you still wouldn't believe me. The honesty of that landed somewhere quiet and deep, because she was right to have considered it. The version of me who had walked out of Mercerin Lane carrying that wound. I wasn't certain that version would have listened. Pride has a way of needing its villains to stay villains, because the alternative is admitting that you suffered for a story that was never entirely true. I left 6 weeks after you did, she continued, not just because of the guilt, but because I went back and looked, really looked, at everything Marcus had touched on that project, and I realized the environment that had allowed that to happen wasn't somewhere I wanted to build anything. She said it without bitterness, just with the measured clarity of someone who had processed something difficult and come out the other side carrying a quiet kind of wisdom rather than an open wound. I looked at her across the small table. The candle between us burned lower now, the lights softer, closer, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel tonight, not anger at the wasted years. Not even relief at the truth finally surfacing, something closer to grief, actually. For 2 people who had respected each other once, who might have become something, colleagues, friends, perhaps something neither of us had the language for yet, and had instead spent 3 years as characters in a story someone else had written for them. I'm sorry, I said, for the hallway, for not listening. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm sorry I didn't send the email. The candle flickered between us. Outside the cafe's window, the street had grown still and dark, the city doing its quiet nighttime breathing, and then her phone lit up on the table. She glanced down, just a reflex, and I watched her expression change. Something moved across her face that she didn't have time to conceal. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. If you've ever held onto a truth too long and paid the price for it, you already know where this is going. Don't go anywhere. She turned her phone face down slowly, deliberately. The way you do when you're hoping someone didn't notice, while knowing they already did. I noticed. Everything okay? I asked. Fine, she said. The word came out smooth enough, but her fingers stayed resting on the back of the phone, and she didn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. I didn't push. But I held the question in the air a moment longer than I might have otherwise, and she felt it. I could tell by the small, almost imperceptible straightening of her posture. We sat with it for a few seconds. The jazz had stopped entirely now. Someone in the kitchen laughed at something, muffled and distant, and then that sound faded too. And it was just the 2 of us and the low burn of the candle and the thing she wasn't saying. Then she exhaled, a quiet, controlled breath, and said, "It's my sister." Her sister, it turned out, had been the one to arrange tonight, not our mutual friend, or rather, not entirely. The setup had moved through a chain of people, the way these things sometimes do, and the original push had come from her sister Claire, who had apparently decided some months ago that Nadia had been alone long enough, and had taken it upon herself to intervene with the particular enthusiasm of someone who believes love is a project that simply requires better project management. Nadia had agreed to tonight partly to stop the persistent conversation about it, and partly, she admitted this with a dry, sideways glance, because she hadn't been entirely opposed to the idea of trying. What she hadn't told Claire was whose name had appeared on the other end of the arrangement. She doesn't know it's you, Nadia said, and the message just now. Nadia's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile but carried too much resignation to fully become one. She wants a progress report. I leaned back slightly. What are you going to tell her? I have absolutely no idea. I watched her look at the phone again, still face down, and something about the gesture made the whole evening suddenly feel very real. Not the revelation about Marcus, not the professional history, not even the careful honesty we had been building across this small table all night. This, the upturned phone, the sister waiting for an update. The completely ordinary, human weight of being known by someone who loves you and wants things for you. It made her real in a way that 3 years of memory and resentment had somehow kept her from being. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She looked up. "You've been asking me things all evening. One more. Go ahead." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. "If our mutual friend had told you my name up front, before tonight, would you have come?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me with that steady, evaluating gaze, the one I had once found professionally intimidating and now found something else entirely, and I let the question sit without trying to fill the silence around it. Finally, she said, "I'd like to think I would have, but I probably would have convinced myself it was a terrible idea and found a very reasonable excuse not to." And now, she tilted her head slightly, the candlelight catching the line of her jaw, the quiet thoughtfulness in her expression. "Now I'm here thinking that reasonable excuses have cost me enough already." The words landed gently, but they landed somewhere important. I had spent 3 years being certain about the wrong things. Certain about her guilt. Certain that leaving was the clean choice. Certain that self-protection and forward motion were the same thing. Sitting here now, I understood they were not. She was watching me with an expression I was only just learning to read. Layered, careful, but with something genuinely open beneath it, like a door that had been unlocked but not yet pushed wide. And I understood something clearly, sitting in that quiet corner of that small cafe, with the night pressing soft against the windows. The next move mattered, not in the way professional decisions matter, where the stakes are career and reputation and quarterly outcomes. In the way that only the true things matter, the ones that don't offer second chances lightly. I opened my mouth to speak, and her phone lit up again. This time she didn't turn it over. This time she looked at the screen, and the color left her face completely. "Don't look away now. This is the part that changes everything, and I need you here for it. If this story is reaching you, hit that like button and stay with me. Nadia." Her name came out before I'd made a conscious decision to say it, because the way she was looking at that screen, still, pale, that careful composure she'd maintained all evening suddenly absent, required something. Even just a word, even just her name spoken quietly across a small table by someone who, an hour ago, she might have considered the last person she'd want present in a difficult moment. She looked up. "It's my mother," she said. "She's been unwell. My sister is saying she's asking for me." She was already reaching for her coat. I didn't think. I just stood. "I'll walk you out," I said. She didn't argue, which told me more about the state she was in than anything else could have. The Nadia I had spent 3 years remembering would have declined on principle, assembled her composure like armor, and walked out with her chin level and her pace steady. This Nadia moved through the cafe with her coat half on, and her bag strap twisted and her eyes focused somewhere far past the room around her. I settled the bill quickly. The waiter, bless him, read the room and made it efficient, and caught up with her near the entrance. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that cities produce in the late hours, when the noise pulls back and leaves something almost gentle in its place. She stopped on the pavement and turned to face me, her coat properly on now, her bag straightened, the outer composure partially reconstructed. But her eyes were doing something she couldn't quite control. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the evening ending like this. Don't apologize for that. It wasn't exactly the resolution either of us probably needed." I looked at her for a moment. The streetlight above us cast everything in a soft amber wash, not unlike the candlelight inside, as though the evening was determined to hold its atmosphere to the very last. "Go be with your family," I said. "That's the only thing that matters right now." Something moved through her expression, a loosening, small but visible, like a held breath finally released. "Daniel," she said quietly. "Yeah, I'm glad I came tonight." A pause. "I'm glad it was you." She left. I stood on that pavement and watched the car pull away, and I stayed there a moment longer than was probably necessary, my hands in my pockets and the cool night air moving around me, thinking about the particular weight of an evening that had carried so much more than either of us had arrived prepared for. 3 years of a story that wasn't true. 2 people shaped by a wound that someone else had deliberately made, and one evening in a quiet cafe that had somehow improbably returned something I hadn't known I was still missing. She texted at midnight. Her mother was stable, resting. They'd caught it early enough. I wrote back immediately, told her I was glad. Told her to rest too. 3 minutes passed. Then, "The jury has reached a verdict, by the way." I stared at that message for a second. Then I remembered, the jury's still deliberating. Better or worse than she remembered. I typed, and she replied, "Considerably better. Don't let it go to your head." I sat in my apartment with my phone in my hand and something warm and unhurried spreading through my chest. The particular feeling of something beginning. Not the urgent consuming rush of early infatuation, but something quieter and more substantial. The feeling of recognizing something real. I typed back, "Dinner again," this time with full disclosure of names, history, and intentions. No surprises. A pause, longer than the others then. Yes, just that, one word. But it arrived like a door being pushed open, not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just gently and all the way. Sometimes the right person doesn't arrive as a stranger. Sometimes they arrive as someone you already know. Someone the wrong story kept you from seeing clearly. And sometimes, if you're fortunate enough, life gives you one quiet evening, a corner table, and the particular grace of a second first impression. I opened the door expecting nothing, and she whispered, "Wait, I know you." Turns out we were only just beginning to. If this story reminded you that some things deserve a second chance, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you're new here, subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.